Welcome to The Pool. I'm your host, Philip McKenzie. I'm the executive director of advancingdiversity.org, which lives as part of the Media Village platform. The Pool is a direct challenge to the flawed notion that the available diverse talent pool is either shallow or non-existent. Each episode of The Pool is an opportunity to engage with and hear from diverse thought leaders in advertising, marketing, media, and beyond. The pool is deeper than you ever thought. All you have to do is jump in. On this episode of The Pool, my guest is Dr. Marcel Rosa-Salas. Dr. Marcel Rosa-Salas is an anthropologist of consumer culture who studies advertising's role in creating racist ideas in America. She is currently an assistant professor of marketing at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Rosa-Salas is the co-editor of Documenting the Nameplate, a forthcoming book about nameplate jewelry culture, and co-host of the Top Rank podcast. Prior to being an anthropologist, she was a culture marketer at Red Bull. And I want to take the time now to welcome you to The Pool.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I have been too. And I wanted to make sure that I used the doctor in your title, given the latest sort of back and forth online and on Twitter about our incoming First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, who famously in the Wall Street Journal was maligned for using the term doctor. So I was always doing this prior to, but I wanted to make sure I really hit that doctor because you earned it.
I appreciate that. 6 years in the making. So it feels nice to hear that. So awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I was really excited about this conversation because, you're someone who, from my interaction with your work, from a prior conversation that we had an opportunity to share before recording this episode, is a deep thinker about the issues of advertising, marketing, and how our race notions and racial ideas are intertwined in those spaces. And it's not often when you are dealing with marketers and those who are advertising professionals that they think deeply about these issues. So it's a real pleasure, and I think a unique opportunity to our listeners to really engage with someone like yourself. So after that prelude, so that's my second introduction to the introduction, I really want to spend some time, talking about where the notion of what is general market or mass market, where did that really originate from? And how do we compare that to the counter notion of what is popularly thought of and branded as multicultural marketing?
Fantastic question, and is pretty much the core research question of my contemporary research, my dissertation, and things I continue to think about. I would say that the general market and the multicultural market are really intertwined concepts and ideas that I think we can trace back to the post-war era. When we think about the mass market as a cultural construct, we can consider the role that post-World War II social and economic policies, such as the GI Bill, for example, played a role in really burgeoning this idea of a middle-class consumer market. In America, a new vision of the United States in the post-World War II period that was really based on a culture of consumerism. And we can also think about how those very policies of creating American culture driven through consumerism was fabricated through economic policies that were so closely tethered to racism, racial discrimination, especially if we think about how the GI Bill, who got access to the economic privileges of the GI Bill, for example, that really set the groundwork of the material groundwork for who got access to this middle-class consumer lifestyle. Those are policies that were shaped by racism, whether formally or informally, through who was able to get access to home loans, who was able to get access to credit and the like. And so you kind of had a class of Americans that got access to certain economic and cultural resources, for lack of a better phrase, that were really marked by a long-standing race-based social hierarchy that is so endemic and core to how American society and consumer society has been structured. And so you have a vision of the mass market, not only in our political realm and our economic domain, but also in the advertising business. You have the image of who the mass market is that advertisers and brands are, imagining and constructing and developing images of and market research of, that is really tied to a notion of the average American as being a white American. And these are, this is a racial idea that is so foundational to the very notion of citizenship in this country, and has been basically transplanted into how brands and their agencies conceptualize the American consumer. And so what I have written about and what I continue to study as an anthropologist is sort of the continual legacy and I guess reverberations of this type of confluence between economic and political norms with our consumer culture and how the business of marketing is done. Not just visually, right? Not just, what we hear, see, and experience, but also the ideas about human beings and the theories about human beings that are really core to the work of marketing and advertising. And so you have this mass market as really being a reflection of, what I put, some people think it's bold, but I just think it's facts, is really a kind of an ideology of white supremacy, right? This idea that the average American, the normal American, the aspirational American is a white person. So you have I would say, in a marketing and advertising industry that is sort of built infrastructurally around this kind of social imaginary of the American consumer public. So with that, there's a whole, as we know, this country is incredibly diverse with many different types of people. And what results from this exclusive notion of the mass market and the general market emerges multicultural marketing as an industry that I think has been in part founded by the reality that, it's been very difficult for Black and Latinx and Asian people in the business to get work, to forge paths in the industry. But also it's kind of tied to the segregated and discriminatory media infrastructure that we have, where you have a white mass media market and a series of specialty racially targeted media outlets that have, emerged in, the post-civil rights period to really meet the needs of audiences and consumers who have historically been excluded from the image of who the American mass market has been, the general market. And so today we kind of see the continual resonances in how this type of what I view as racially segregated marketing and advertising business infrastructure be contested, be called into question, but still be somewhat put into place. But I think we're at a moment in time where, given census projections and just how the very complexion of this country is changing, that whole paradigm is being called into question, and rightfully so.
You said so many things in that statement that I think is really important, because though brief, it took us from this very beginning of this consumer culture, as you highlighted, to the current moment where there is really a structure that exists in the advertising and marketing industry that is really in lockstep with these legacy ideas of who is the target consumer versus who is not. So there seems to be this weird sort of dynamic going on where you rightfully cited there is an aspirational notion, which is largely framed by whiteness. And then there's what, I think of as this objectification notion, which is everything not white, but usually white, Black, and then down the line in terms of how we have framed our racial hierarchy. So it's okay for, and I'm dating some of these references, but it's okay for Black people and Latinos and Native Americans to be branded objects, but yet they're not being marketed to as real consumers or participants in the market. So I want to give you an opportunity to, really react to that idea, and I guess bring us full circle to the current moment where we've seen some reckoning with some of that. Some.
Right, right. That's a great point that you bring up about, this routine situation that we see come up time and time again about how, people of color are, habitually seen as resources, as, um, objectified entities to be exploited, and have value extracted. And how that kind of plays out in, our consumer culture, our media culture, right? Like what cultural phenomena get popularized and appropriated, but which groups are not like given monetary and appropriate credit and things of the like. I think that that is a central element of what I and so many other scholars call American racial capitalism. Which is an idea that basically links, the founding of the United States' commitment to a capitalist economy to racism and racialized exploitation of human beings, and creating a social hierarchy that's based on using the idea of race. Inventing the idea of race as a way to mark certain bodies and certain populations and groups of people as more exploitable than others. And so I think that kind of premise that we see continue to be the foundation of how our labor markets are organized, the distribution of resources, not only just in this country, but around the world. We see it manifest in some of the most iconic brands in this country. I mean, we can think of, you mentioned the reckoning that's been going on in the wake of the uprisings that happened this summer. We have Aunt Jemima, which is a brand that we all know well, but is supremely steeped in this type of racial capitalist notion of I guess, mourning the days of slavery and kind of reimagining, retooling, and refiguring this type of mythology into the present day. I mean, there's so many examples that we could talk about. And I think that, the advertising industry, of course, is all about culture, right? And like responding to culture. I think about my role in, as a former marketer before I came into academia. And as I said, it was very much about reacting to what's going on. So I wasn't quite surprised when brands, during the summer were taking a stand, as it were, and showing their political allegiances or alliances to standing against racism or fighting up against that. I think that, though, what we have to be, I guess, vigilant about moving forward, especially marketers, because it seems like this, brand purpose type of racial justice brand positioning almost is becoming its own type of, it's becoming a trend. I mean, that's easy. It's easy to say. I think that I would say marketers today who are working in this space, who are thinking of, being reactive to this type of enduring social problem that we have, need to be really critically aware of not exploiting racial justice or themes of anti-racism for a branding benefit, because I think that it becomes another type of another form of exploitation, akin to, I would say, the types of racial ideas that certain more problematic brands have kind of trafficked in for centuries. But I think that we tread a slippery slope that I feel like we need to, that I don't know why I'm including myself into we as marketers, but that brand marketers I think need to be vigilant of and critically assess, like what's the long-term vision for how racial justice, racial equality is being spoken about, is being leveraged. I hate that word, leveraged by brands. And how can companies ensure that this is not something else to be used, but actually something, a movement to support in a substantive way?
And that kind of brings me to another point, which is, how do we not so much ride the line, but how would a thoughtful marketer, a thoughtful brand, not seek to appropriate, but actually seek to work in solidarity with those that are really engaged in these issues. And I think about, to kind of go back maybe to the very beginning of your thesis, this World War II and even pre-World War II, because I'm talking about like depression type of
Mm-hmm.
WPA branding, right? It was like, we're all in this together to defeat the depression and we're all put America back to work and all this kind of stuff. I think people in branding will be familiar with that sort of WPA iconography.
Mm-hmm.
And now it feels like we're going back to that when it comes to COVID and the pandemic and this celebration of essential workers, so to speak. And it's different but similar. So I'm curious, how do you think about whether we're appropriating racial justice or appropriating the idea of the worker? How do you resist the inclination to appropriate while also understanding the cultural zeitgeist in which some of these ideas exist?
Mm-hmm.
Or
That's a great
can it even be done? I don't know. I'm hoping a smart person can help me.
That's such a great question, and I hadn't thought of before the sort of WPA, you know, elevation of workers, that kind of like ethos being, sort of replicated in our current times. That's a really interesting point that I never considered. I think, I feel like partly this sort of appropriation and reactiveness to current culture is kind of endemic to what marketing is. So on I like how you said, is it possible? Because this is something I'm still thinking about now in terms of what are brands sort of like functional and cultural relationship to the world around us, and what role can they play in sort of and should we expect them to play in mitigating and helping solve such deeply rooted social issues and political issues that, of course, they as cultural forces, as corporations that play a huge role in our economy. They're obviously these companies are obviously embedded in questions of racism and racial injustice, no question. For me, the ongoing question is if and how can brands be involved. I think for me, one of the powerful places to start, especially since you brought up earlier about marketers being thoughtful, is having marketing professionals really get a sense of their place in history, and also the marketing as an institution that creates ideas, because I don't think we often think about brands and marketers as being idea creators and almost like theorists about what it means to be a person, what it means to be in society, and it's not just about the cultural impact is not just about like sales or about like brand affinity. It's about, great brands, powerful brands shape the way we view the world and think about ourselves, especially when it comes to our notions of, what it means to belong to a nation, what it means to belong to a particular social group, what it means to belong to a particular race or gender. So I think that if marketing professionals kind of reckon with that role that they play, and I think that a lot of that has to do with education. And I know that there's been critiques of this idea of like listening and learning and reading. There has to be action, but I do think there's something to be said for what some activists would call consciousness raising, right? Like actually educating oneself, not just on the issue of race in America, right, which is like such a big topic, but really narrowing in on what role has marketing played in producing racial ideas in the past and in the present, and how can marketers as idea creators, as theorists about humanity, really become, I would say, anthropologists of their own process, anthropologists of their own I don't know, idea creation. And it takes some like meta work, right? This, as a cultural anthropologist, I'm always like thinking, like seeing like what is really going on, or trying to think a little bit of a level above. But I think there's a sort of an intentionality to try to understand marketing's place in the creation of these social problems and these political crises that we call racism in America, that I think is a place to see what are some of the patterns that have emerged historically and presently, where we can see, issues of appropriation, exploitation, stereotyping. I think that kind of critical thought is necessary about the past and about the present, is necessary to move any organization forward, but particularly marketing, I would say.
And, gauging where we are in the arc, it leads me to kind of my final two thoughts, which is, in this moment of reckoning, there's a lot of talk going on in the industry about how do we change the industry. When I say industry, I mean marketing, advertising, media, right? Just lumping them all together, though they clearly all play different roles, right? But, we've all seen ads, we've all seen things on, whether it's commercial or something online or something in print, where it's like, how did this ever get made? Like, how was there no one in the room? There's always there was no one in the room that could raise the point about this questionable piece of work that hit the world. And so with that as a frame, I want to ask you first, given what we know of how ideas are born, how important culture is it possible for any one person that was in the room to affect the kind of change that cuts these ideas off before they get a chance to see the light of day? So that's one piece. And then the second piece, given the sort of hierarchical way in which we've ghettoized the work itself, right? Where multicultural agencies do multicultural work. And, if we're buying, Black media through these mediums, can we change the way this operates if the institutions themselves are still in a racial hierarchy? So kind of two questions, one individual, one institutional. Go.
Totally. I mean, and they're so connected. They're so connected because the point about, individuals, I keep, of course, thinking about the Pepsi, the now canonical like train wreck that was that Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad that I feel like has become this sort of hallmark of everything that can go wrong. But there's so many other examples. I think there's oftentimes, and I've been in some of these rooms, rooms where there are people who may have a certain perspective or have a particular point of view and but don't feel empowered, to speak because of, certain corporate cultures or just like the hierarchies that exist in any type of organization and a culture that's created. Who's empowered to really give their point of view in a way that they feel like will be listened to and respected and they won't be penalized. And so I think that it's hard and it's challenging to relegate any change to one individual, because I think really true transformation comes from collective social action. It comes from groups of people coming together and coalescing and having a vision for the world that they want to see and imagining ways to get there. And I feel like, ironically, advertising is kind of like well suited. It's a dream factory of our society and of our world in terms of imagining what is possible. So part of me feels like maybe people in the industry are sort of uniquely equipped to kind of try to envision what a new industry could look like. But I don't think it like any social change, it can't just be on one person. It has to be from across stakeholders, across levels of an organization in order for anything to truly happen. I think this is why we see this like endemic problem of the DEI chief or the DEI consultant who who may have this sort of seemingly like plush and powerful role, but if it's again, it's an individual. It's one person who is accountable for an entire, set of very intertwined social and political issues that actually need buy-in and participation from everyone, because at the end of the day, I think racism is clearly a political, moral, and economic crisis of centuries long proportions, but it's also a set of ingrained cultural practices that I feel like we have been. I think the popular discourse has been is unconscious, right? Because we don't realize it. I disagree with the whole idea of unconscious bias. I think we need to start taking responsibility of how our biases are actually conscious series of cultural practices that together we have to work together to become aware of, dismantle, and create anew for a better world for everyone. And so I think connecting to the second point of your question in terms of this type of ingrained multicultural marketing, general market business infrastructure, yeah, I mean, what a naughty question that continues to, I guess, like pull up, keep a lot of people up at night. I think that they're in multicultural marketing, and I had the honor and the privilege of doing fieldwork research with so many leading professionals on that side of the business who really have, I would say, I mean, I don't want to speak to anyone's intentions, but really have a commitment to wanting to remake the industry in a way that's positive, that's more inclusive. But as you said, are often ghettoized, for lack of a better term, marginalized. And that has very much to do with how our ideas of human life and who is valuable in our society is so connected to racism. Like if you just think about, conversations that may happen at a media agency and an ad agency, we're thinking about who is the target, who is the valuable target. Oftentimes you'll find, at least I found in my research, that very pervasive political ideas about, which groups' lives are more valuable than others. Like, do Black Lives Matter, right? That's a question about value. And we see that kind of happen in questions and media plans about multicultural marketing and things of that nature. So I think that clearly we have an industry, at least in the United States, that, I would say, I mean, at least for 50 years has been set up, if not longer, has been set up with a certain set of businesses, industry relationships, ways of thinking that have to be upended if we want to, if marketers, I keep lumping myself into marketers. I guess like my old, my goodness, forgive me.
Your old life rearing its head.
The old life. But if the industry really wants to reimagine and it has to, this country's on the fast track of becoming a very different sort of demographic fabric, for lack of a better phrase. And so I think that the industry is going to it's going to have no choice but to innovate. The question is, what are kind of the political and the cultural debates, turf wars, if you were, that are going to happen because there is such a deep investment in the way things are, right? So I think it is, speaking to that point about collective transformation, it's going to have to be a really creative reimagining of what advertising and marketing looks like. But as I said, I think that industry professionals, if they're committed to critically thinking about their place in our society and their role as, vision makers about what our world is, and really innovative, reframing about what the industry can be in the future. Of course, I think it's possible, but the question is the will to do it there. We know we have the research. We have all the data that we could possibly need. I think there needs to really be a reckoning with, who's willing to give up power, how are people going to work together, and really considering what's at stake in the future of all this.
I think that's using our collective will toward building something better within the industry is a perfect place to leave it. We are equipped with all the tools. I couldn't say it any better, so I won't even try to restate it. I think what's important about this conversation, because we could have gone on much longer than we have, because I think we've barely scratched the surface, is that I'm hoping that this won't be our last conversation. I know it won't be, but I like to put that in the universe, that this won't be our last conversation. But more importantly, that as people listen to this, particularly the many marketing and media and advertising professionals that are engaging with the show, that they will, take this to heart, and that will continue to hammer home just how important it is for us to have, real substantive work that's going to truly tackle these issues. So, Doctor, I want to thank you for joining me on the pool.
Thanks so much for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you so much.